Um, I don't think I went over this very well last week, but part of requirement 5 is also to do a I think I just want like a one paragraph thing talking about how not having one of the documents we're going over as part of the founding documents of the nation would affect you and your family. We can pull up the exact wording for the requirement here, so that it's not quite so excellent. Uh, let's just put that up there. Ambiguous here. Let me see if I can't find. Close tabs. I don't have it in my doc this week. Merit badge requirements. Hey, there it is. This one. No, not this one. Where'd it go? This one. 4. This part of it. Tell how you would feel that might be different with each one. I think I just want like a one paragraph around that. I'm spending a lot of time on going over the documents because I think it's important for the class. I think it's an important part of the class to understand these documents because they kind of get glossed over sometimes. But other than that, I just want like a one paragraph for this. So don't have to get super detailed, top level type of stuff. Anyhow, so let's get through the rest of the document. So Article 2, much like Article 1, rather than laying out the legislative branch, lays out the executive branch, our presidential branch. Remember, each branch of the government has different goals for how it's meant to interact for the people. So keep that in mind as we start to go through some of these requirements. To be president, first off, you have to be 35 years old. You have to be a naturally born citizen, which means you can't be naturalized. So you can't have been born somewhere else and then moved to the United States and got your citizenship that way. You have to be born into. So you can do that two ways. You can either do it through being in the United States when you're born. So on American ground, you're born, you're a citizen at that point. Or through your parents being citizens, you can also become a naturally born citizen that way as well. You also have to live in the States for 14 years. Remember, you can't move away. And if you haven't lived in the States for the last 14 years, you can't run for president. The reason they set that out is they wanted somebody fairly wise, as you would put it, in the presidency. There's not a lot beyond that. It's meant to be somebody that's have some years under him. We don't want a hothead as the president, and those founding fathers thought us young people were a little bit too rash sometimes. So 35 years old for that one. I think that's really all we need on that. They also laid out the congressional powers, the constitutional, not congressional, the constitutional powers of the president. The big important ones, probably the most important one, is the president's ability to veto and also to sign laws into power. A little asterisk there. He does sign treaties, but it also requires congressional approval for the United States to actually follow them. So, does anybody know what the power of veto actually means?
It's the power to decline something, almost like as if to shut it down.
Yes. So the way our lawmaking process goes is after the congressional branch of the government writes and approves those laws with a simple majority, so that means just greater than 50%, it then goes to the president. The president then has the option to either sign or veto the bill. He also has a third kind of hidden option, which is do nothing. If he does nothing after a week, it will become law, unless it's at the end of his term. So if we're at the end of Congress being open and he doesn't sign the law, it's called a pocket veto, which means it also doesn't become law. So if it can't go back to Congress, it can't just instantly become, it can't be on its own become a law. Which means if the president vetoes a bill, to override the president, the congressional branch of the government would require a supermajority, meaning they would have to get 2/3 of both the House of Representatives and the Senate to agree on that bill and vote for it in favor of it. Very rarely happens. Supermajorities are hard to get. It's hard to get that many people to agree on one thing. So typically, if a president vetoes a bill, it's dead in the water. It's done. It's not very often they get bills around him. And that's huge. One man can both either essentially kill a bill or let it through. The president has a lot of power on that one. He can hold it over Congress. It's been done before with like budgets, for instance. The president can essentially hold the congressional budget as hostage until they do what he wants, because he won't sign it into law. The president is also commander in chief. Does anybody know what that means? The president is both ceremonially and practically in charge of the military. So when generals go to the field and either conduct war or conduct policing operations, whatever they particularly call it in that particular conflict, they do it on the whim of the president. So whim isn't quite right. On the command of the president. So the president has the power to tell generals, admirals, air commanders what to do and where to go. He doesn't typically get into the nitty gritty with them. He's more of an overarching goal sort of standpoint. For instance, like FDR didn't get particularly involved with the on the ground decisions during World War II. He mainly just decided he would have told Sherman that we want to open a second front. And then the generals have been left to plan and go about that. He just provides kind of the goals and that sort of front. However, the president does not have the ability to declare war. So the last congressional war we really had, we have to go back to like Korea. Korea was the last, well, I think Afghanistan had congressional approval as well, now that I think about it. But the president doesn't have the power to declare war on another nation. He can do things that are in the national interest. That's where Vietnam essentially came from. Was wow, I cannot remember his name. I almost said Nixon, but that's not right. I can't remember the name of the president that got us involved in Vietnam. Vietnam, there was never a formal war declared. The president just got us involved under the guise of securing the national interest, which is another one of his powers, is to provide national security. So that's how we got involved in a conflict like Vietnam. I really need to stop saying good lord. That's pretty much it for the commander-in-chief side. He also can appoint. Anybody know what he can appoint? There's two main things that the president appoints. Does anybody know the first or the second?
No.
Probably the most important one is the president appoints his cabinet. So the president is also the commander-in-chief of our bureaucracies. So Congress has the power to create a department, like the Department of Agriculture or the EPA or the Department of Commerce. Those are all created through congressional laws. However, the president runs the day-to-day operations of those, and by extension, he appoints the heads of those departments. So when a president takes office, he will typically clear out most of the cabinet and replace all of the heads of the departments with people he approves of. That's why we get news like when the president fired the head of the FBI. He has the power to fire the head of the FBI and replace it with somebody that's going to do what he wants. So he has the power to appoint those cabinet officials. He also gets the power to appoint judges, most importantly of which, Supreme Court judges. There is a check on this power. Congress has to approve his appointees. Because remember, well, we haven't got to that point yet, but Supreme Court judges serve for life. So when a president puts a Supreme Court judge in, it's going to extend much beyond his time in office. So when he appoints somebody, that's going to be a more or less permanent staple for the country for the next 20 to 30 years of having that Supreme Court justice. So it's a huge power because of the judicial review and the ability of the Supreme Court to essentially shoot down laws. So whenever a Supreme Court justice is getting ready to retire, there's this huge interest about who the president is going to appoint, what that judge did in the past, and that's where also you see. I don't know how many memes you guys watch, but it's also where you get the meme of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's one of the Supreme Court judges. She's very old. There's lots of people worrying she's going to die before Trump leaves office, and he's going to get to appoint a Supreme Court judge to replace her, and that will swing the favor of the Supreme Court. I think we're at 4-3 right now on Democrats to Republicans. So if Trump gets to appoint a new Supreme Court justice, then that will swing the favor of the Supreme Court to the other party. So there's lots of people hoping Ruth Bader Ginsburg can last through the Trump presidency. Hey, Dwight D. Eisenhower. So, the president, to a lesser extent, also has the power to pardon. Does anybody know what pardoning means? Oh, come on.
I
It's like one of those things that I feel like I do know, but
The
the
most famous one was Truman pardoned Nixon.
Hey, I know the definition of the word, but I don't know the context to use it in this way.
So the president can pardon people of any crime. So he can just let them out of jail. You'll typically see this at the end of presidencies because presidents really don't want to put a target on their back by pardoning a bunch of people that somebody might not agree with. So you'll see, I think Obama pardoned like 250 people on his way out of office or something like that. It's meant to act as a check on the judicial system. So if the country decides, yeah, this guy was guilty, but we don't think he deserved it, the president, or governor for that matter, can step in and pardon that individual. In the Truman to Nixon example, Truman pardoned Nixon of the Watergate scandal. So before Nixon was ever convicted on that, Truman pardoned him, so we never got a trial for that side of things. That's also why a lot of people think Truman never made it to a second term, because he put a big target on his back by letting Nixon off for nothing. So that's the power of pardon. So the president gets elected through something called the Electoral College. This is an excellent example of the founders' lack of trust in direct democracy. The Electoral College is a system where instead of us directly voting and a president winning a simple popular majority, becoming president, it's actually decided based off states. Electoral delegates are assigned similarly to how House of Representatives are assigned. However, the states have control over how those electoral delegates will actually be handled. Most of them divide them up into districts, and then typically electoral delegates will follow their voting block. So when you vote for a president, you're not directly voting for the president, you're voting to sway the opinion of your electoral college delegate, and they will typically do what their districts want. Indirect democracy, baby. The U.S. also has a majority system. So a president has to get half of the delegates. You can't win with 49% of the delegates. If you get 49% of the delegates, the election means nothing. That's why we've ended up in this divulged two-party system, because if you don't take enough, you don't win anything. It's very different to how some of the prime minister systems work. So like if you look over in England, they don't have a winner-take-all mentality. Essentially, instead of having a president that the people elect in, the Senate, when it takes power, elects their prime minister. Well, their equivalent of a Senate. They'd call it the House of Lords and the House of Commons. but their legislative branch decides on their prime minister. So you can have parties that are much smaller. That's why they have 4 or 5 parties in England, because a party can take a 10% majority of the legislative branch and then partner with a different party to decide on a prime minister. That's why you hear sometimes in England they won't be able to form a government because none of the parties will be able to get a big enough majority to elect a prime minister. Versus us, we decide on the president, and then Senate is a totally separate matter, and they have no say in how the executive branch is going to work. That's why we end up with a very segmented 2-party system, versus some other systems end up with a 3, 4, 5-party system. It has good and bad things about it, but that's how we got where we are today with a 2-party system. And that's why every time a third party tries to form, it typically dissolves quickly, because when that party forms, it's typically a segment of another party. Like, for instance, the Libertarian Party typically saps some votes. If there wasn't a Libertarian Party, most of those votes would probably go to the Democrats. That's why some Democrats see the Libertarian Party as undermining the Democratic Party, because it takes away their ability to get a majority sometimes. Because if they would have gotten, 55% if the Libertarian Party wasn't involved, and the Libertarian Party takes 6% of the votes, now they no longer get the majority. And that causes a problem. That's why the winner-take-all mentality isn't super thought to be amazing these days, but it is what it is. If the president cannot get a majority of the electoral delegates, the House of Representatives decides. So basically, if the president doesn't get a majority of electoral delegates, the election's more or less thrown out, and then the House of Representatives gets to vote on the candidates and decide who is going to be president. So, I don't think it's happened, but it could. So, the more you know. Moving along here. The judicial branch is kind of interesting. The Founding Fathers decided there's going to be a judicial branch. They also decided that the judicial branch will have a Supreme Court, and that court will be the big dog. It will be the Supreme Court of the land. So it will overrule every other court in the entire country. But they left it up largely to the states, largely to the legislative branch. So the court system that we know and love today, the federal side at least, was set up in the 1789 Judicial Act. And that actually defines that we'll have district courts and regional courts, and all of them will roll up to the Supreme Court. But that wasn't actually really written in the Constitution. It just said, there's going to be courts. Figure it out later. This Article 3 also narrowly defined treason. I personally think it came from a fear of, in some of the foreign countries at the time, monarchs could accuse somebody of treason for pretty much anything. So it very narrowly defined that as an act of war against the United States. And in order to be convicted for treason, you either have to confess or there has to be 2 witnesses of your treasonous act. That's why you don't hear of people getting convicted under treason in the United States. There's typically some other law that's easier to convict on, like terrorism or something like that. Questions so far on the executive or the judicial branch? Excellent. Okay. So that's our 3 branches of government. There's also some other things that got put into place. Remember, this was written after the Articles of Confederation. So one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation is it left a lot of states with a lot of power. So we had states that acted more like countries rather than what we know of as states today, as being members of the greater union and acting in each other's in everybody's best interest. So one of the things they put in here was a full faith and credit clause, one of those which makes legal proceedings cross state lines. That's why if you get married in California, you can move to New York and you're still married. This is a little gray sometimes. We see it with some of the gun licensing laws here in the States, where certain states are refusing to honor some of these, like concealed carry permits. Some do, some don't. And we saw it particularly with things like gay marriage, for instance. Some states treat gay marriage like any other marriage, but then some states won't honor that. So, for instance, Alabama was one of the ones involved with that, where they would not honor gay marriage licenses and they wouldn't treat them properly. I'm surprised we haven't seen a Supreme Court ruling on it, but I guess it's just never made it there. There's also a clause in here that prevents discrimination of citizens based off which state they're from. Remember, at this point in the nation, most people don't identify as an American. They will identify as a Texan or a New Yorker or a Virginian. They're not an American yet. That sort of sense of national unity really hasn't been developed. So you could see states passing laws that would discriminate against a Virginian if they moved to Florida or vice versa. So there's a clause in here specifically set to make that not okay. They also set up the extradition system. So the extradition system means if I cross a state line and commit a crime, if I commit a crime here in Indiana and I run to New York, there's a clause in the Constitution that allows the governor of New York to extradite me all the way back to Indiana to get tried for my crimes. This is excluded on like federal. If you break a federal law, they don't need to extradite you. They can just take you to a federal court. It's where the term felonies and misdemeanors kind of break the difference. Felonies are convicted by the federal government. Misdemeanors and other minor crimes are convicted by state governments. So you can be extradited. There was also a fugitive slave clause in this part of the Constitution. However, that was eventually nullified by the 13th Amendment, I think. Don't quote me on that. It might be the 14th. I don't remember. It nullified most of any of the slave language in the Constitution. The Article 4 also set the path to statehood and how that would work. It also put the federal government in charge of those territories that are working their way towards statehood. So the federal government has a lot of power over some of our state territory, our national territories, like Puerto Rico, for instance. They more or less control the goings on there. They leave a lot of that power to the Puerto Rico government. They also, fun fact, did you know that Puerto Rico has senators? They just don't get to vote on anything. So they get to go to the Senate and be there and be representatives of the Puerto Rico government. Their vote just doesn't count for anything. So the more you know. They also so anyway, Congress was also set as the gatekeeper to statehood, so they control the process and the paperwork and all that good jazz. Questions on Article 4? All right, let's keep on keeping on. So, Article 5 set out the way that amendments... Sorry. She knows I'm in a meeting. I don't know why she expected me to take that call. It set out the amendment process and the ratification process for amendments. So, let me ask you guys this. Do you guys understand the difference between an amendment and a ratification? Does anybody have any guesses on what the difference is? Or a proposed amendment. I'm sorry, a proposed amendment and a ratified amendment. So, amendments to the Constitution require a supermajority to get through. So, the legislative branch of government can write an amendment, and then if it gets approved with a 2/3 supermajority in both the House and the Senate, it then goes up for ratification. Ratification goes to the states. The states have to ratify amendments to the Constitution. They entered the Union on their own, so they have to agree to changes on the contract of the Union, which is the Constitution. So, Congress can pass a proposed amendment, and it is not law. It does not become law until the states ratify that amendment, and it takes 3/4 of the states to agree to an amendment for it to be ratified and become law. So, it creates this interesting thing. we have amendments that are still up for ratification that were passed through the House and the Senate that have never been ratified. There's one about fugitive slave laws. There's another child labor law one that's up for ratification that's never been ratified. What was the other one that was interesting? I can't remember. So this created, so for instance, the 27th Amendment is one of the best examples of there not being a time limit. The 27th Amendment was proposed and made it through Congress in 1789 was when it was proposed. The 27th Amendment deals with Congress members getting raises. So remember, they get to vote on their own raises? Well, the 27th Amendment said, sure, you can decide your wage, but you don't get that money until you face the voting block. So if you can't get reelected, you don't get your raise. Is essentially what the 27th Amendment says. And it was not ratified until 1992. So we went an entire 100 years with this amendment up in the air, and then just all of a sudden in 1992, enough states decided, yeah, I want that to be a thing, and it was ratified. This doesn't happen too much anymore. Most of the time when a proposed amendment goes up, they'll write in a time limit for that ratification time period. So if it's not ratified by such and such date, this is no longer a valid proposal. Congress will write that in, so we don't end up with these amendments just floating around for infinite periods of time. But it still creates kind of an interesting scenario where we still have amendments from the 1700s available to be ratified today. So moving on. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause. The first thing this article does is it describes that the United States, remember, we're a country at this point when we're trying to decide on the Constitution. It wasn't that we wrote the Constitution, ratified it, and then became the United States. No, we were the United States long before we had the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation made that happen. So one of the things they wrote into this was essentially the U.S. saying, we're good for it. We're going to uphold all of our debts. All our previous agreements are still valid. We're still the United States. Don't worry, foreign countries. Keep your treaties with us. So that was one of the things they did. And also made it clear to the states that in a push and pull of power grabs, the federal government wins. So the federal government is superior to the state's government. So if there's a disagreement between the two, the federal government wins. We get to decide. This was put in here, once again, looking back to the Articles of Confederation, that the federal government had no power to do anything. They could sign a treaty, but if the states wouldn't play along, they couldn't enforce it at all. One of the kind of cutesy things that happened because of this was our peace treaty with England almost fell apart because the federal government agreed to not to freely let British troops pass through the states to leave the forts in the West. But state troops were bothering the British troops as they were trying to leave the country, and Britain just about reneged on the peace agreement. There was also problems with some of the rebels were essentially taking revenge against some of the loyalists to the crown after the Revolutionary War, and that was also part of the treaty that wouldn't happen. And the federal government couldn't do anything about it because it wasn't them, it was the states, and they had no way to reprimand the states for doing things like that. They didn't have control over a military. It had essentially been defunded at that point. They had no money to pay a military, so the national military fell apart. So the only thing left were state militias. So what is the federal government going to do when they could just invade Washington, D.C.? So that created an interesting problem. This also set up, you know how when the president takes office, he takes an oath to the Constitution? Same with governors and senators. Section 3 also set that up. Section 7 was the ratification process for the Constitution. So the ratification process created something that was kind of interesting. This is an excellent example of, even though they didn't necessarily trust direct democracy, they still wanted it to be a founding. So this wasn't unlike the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution wasn't meant to be a document of states coming together. The Constitution was meant to be a document of people coming together. So first off, we still needed a 3/4 majority to ratify the Constitution. But unlike amendments, this is done through conventions. So instead of it getting kicked to the states' governments to decide to ratify the Constitution or not, this was instead kicked to constitutional conventions where the people would vote on whether or not to ratify the Constitution. So that was kind of interesting. We also did not get a unanimous ratification process until the Bill of Rights was passed later on. New Hampshire actually didn't even run a constitutional convention until after the Bill of Rights was passed, because they wanted those to be in the Constitution before they signed it. But once that happens, it was eventually unanimously ratified. And that's it. That's all I got to get through tonight. That's all I really wanted to get through tonight. Questions? Comments? Let's do, since we got some extra time, and Carson's dying.
Carson died.
I would like to kick it back to you guys. I want to touch the main things I want you guys to take from this is I want you to understand why each branch of the government exists and what its role is in the federal government system. So, Micah, since we got 3 of you and I have 3 branches of government,
oh boy,
let's hear your description. What is the legislative branch?
This is like 6th grade stuff, and I forgot it.
I'll give you a hint. It's made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate.
Okay, House of Representatives. It's the branch like all the senators and like the governors from each state. That kind of like Republicans and Democrats that enforce like part of the laws in the system.
There's one key phrase we're looking for. There's one thing that is overwhelmingly important about the legislative branch. What is the thing they do? They write the laws. That's all they do. They write the laws. The legislative branch writes the laws. That's the big takeaway. Your senators and your House representatives write laws. And then by vote, they decide which laws will eventually go to the president. Carson, what does the president do? What does the executive branch of the government do?
Well, I mean, he goes through and either approves like the bills and turns them into laws or vetoes them. He's also head chief of like the military and everything. He can't declare war, I guess.
Correct. What's the last one to really keep in mind is the appointment thing. What does the power to appoint really do?
Oh no. Why did I forget this?
So if it's to break it down into one sentence, the president enforces the laws. He does this through appointees. He sets up the departments. So all the departments that you might apply to, like if you apply for a Pell Grant from the federal government through the Department of Education, the head of that department is appointed and controlled by the president. If you get arrested for breaking a federal law by the FBI, that is done under the power of the president. If one of your parents' farms, all the grants they get are decided out how they're going to get handed out by the Department of Agriculture, which gets their power from the president. The day to day is decided by the president. That's his true power. Reese, what does the judicial branch do? Do you have a mic? Oh, he doesn't have a mic, does he? Oh, okay. All right, come on. Give me your one-liner about what you think the judicial branch does. The suspenses. Make laws? No! They don't write laws! We just went over this! The legislative branch writes laws. The judicial branch doesn't have a good one-liner. But these days their main point is to check the power of the other two. That's okay. That's why we're doing this. We're trying to break it down to the nitty-gritty, if you will. The judicial branch passes punishment, essentially. So they're the ones that after the law is enforced by the president, he kicks you over the judicial branch and they decide your punishment. They also get the power of review. That actually wasn't written into the Constitution, but was taken in a Supreme Court case shortly thereafter. That's where you get things like where the Supreme Court will hear a case and say, that's unconstitutional, it no longer exists. Recent times, the Supreme Court did it with some of Trump's immigration laws. Not laws, executive orders. They said those executive orders are not constitutional, therefore they cannot be enforced. All right, last thing. What is an interesting takeaway from everything we've gone through that you guys didn't know was in the Constitution that you might have learned about? Carson, would you be so kind? Since I have such a small class, we'll start with you first. You got to unmute your mic.
Yeah.
And I was muted. I'm sorry. I
That's
completely
okay.
forgot I was muted. Whoops. Something I learned. I guess I didn't really understand the appoint, like the power to appoint part, like that. I don't think I'd really heard about that before. Under
That's
like
good.
the executive branch.
About how much power that retains?
Yeah.
All right, Micah, what's your takeaway?
I didn't know the president couldn't be the one who declared war.
Oh, you thought the president could declare war?
Yeah.
Yeah, takes congressional approval. It's kind of interesting because he can still send the military places without a declaration of war, but it limits the scope of which he can send things. So, all right, Reese, what is your interesting takeaway? Oh, on like in the territories. Oh yeah, that they don't retain. That's why they're not a state yet, so they don't get to participate in the union. There has been some talks of introducing Puerto Rico into the union, but the incredible amount of partisanship we have these days means that at any given point, depending on the political leaning of that state, will make it so the other party doesn't want it to become a state because it will change the balance of senators the next year. So it does some oddball stuff. I think so I didn't know all of these things going into this course, of course. I spent some time researching. I think the most interesting thing I took from this was the amendment part, about how amendments could just stay up in the air indefinitely. I did not realize the time gap between the proposal and the ratification of the 27th Amendment. I thought that was fantastic. That's all I got for this week. Next week, we're going to try and do the same thing we did this week, quickly banging through, as I type a V into chat for some reason. We're going to try and quickly bang through all of the rest of the amendments. We already went through kind of the first batch in the Bill of Rights, so we're going to try and get through the rest of the amendments next week, and then that'll wrap up requirement 4, and you guys can write your paragraph of pretty much anything for that. You can start it if you would like to, but it's not super important. I'm hoping to leave you some class time to do it next week. And then the week after that, I'm going to have these papers digitalized by then. Hopefully I'll have them next week, so if you guys want to skim through them, you can. But 2 weeks from now, we'll, in class, go through and read the papers. I might actually go to a newer set. I'm not sure. I kind of like this week's set of papers, so we might keep them. So we'll go through a week's worth of papers, and one of the requirements is to talk about the events of those papers and how it affected you and your family and all that good jazz. Questions? How is this going so far? I know last week was pretty terrible. It was pretty dry. I got way too detailed. Is this a better format?
Yeah, I think it's better to understand as well.
Okay. How was you were a part? I know a couple of you guys were here. How was the Bill of Rights part when we went through that stuff? Was that? I feel like it was closer to this. I'm still trying to decide how I want to run this a little bit. Do you guys remember that at all? I know it was 3 weeks ago, so probably not. That's okay.
I mean, a little bit. Yeah, I think it worked out pretty well.
Okay. So basically, just don't do what I did last week, and we'll be good. I lost everybody last week. So, all right. That's all I got. I'm going to stop the recording.